The Gene An Intimate History is a book by Siddhartha Mukherjee. And no prizes for guessing, it's about the genes. The book really gives you an interesting and a comprehensive perspective on how our understanding of genes or hereditary traits it has evolved from the times of ancient Greece to the modern world now when we understand genes and pretty much play with them. This may sound like a book on medical sciences and genetics, which it is, but then these ideas have a lot of political and social and even sometimes religious consequences. As we have discussed in one of the earlier podcasts about the book called Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins, you see how these ideas can create controversies. And that's why the understanding of genes is all the more important because it has many dimensions to it. So the book really gives you a great insight to our genes. And I'm sure you'll read the book, and in this podcast I'm going to cover what all things this book will tell you or will explain to you. So first of all, the story of the gene, it begins in 1864 with Austrian botanist Gregor Johann Mendel. So as a part of an experiment in breeding plants, Mendel noticed that parent plants, they passed on specific traits to the next generation of the child plants. So that is, those traits remained unaltered. Now, that's a very commonsensical thing to have. You see all around you in humans and animals, there are hereditary traits that are passed on from one generation to another. But it was then in 19th century, it was medically being examined and explored. So when they studied this thing, that is when they identified these indivisible units which were being passed down from one generation to another, then we discovered the gene. Because otherwise, we instinctively knew that these traits are being passed down from one generation to another. We just didn't know how it worked. We didn't know what is it called, how is it the blood, is it something else, what is happening here. So as more people studied this, and when the scientists and researchers, they saw it in the light of Darwin's theory, it perfectly made sense. And we learned that through genes, some kind of genetic information is being passed from one generation to the other. And then we learn about what really the gene is and what is it made of. And that's when in the early 20th century and throughout the 20th century, biochemists and scientists, they started examining the workings of the cells. And that's when they found out, and then they discovered that in the nucleus of the cell, there were certain molecules called DNA and its close relative RNA. And these molecules were named as nucleic acids, as they were found in the cell's nucleus. And the author, of course, goes more into the details, which I'm not going to discuss here, but we can pause here for a bit and understand that there is DNA, which is deoxyribonucleic acid, and RNA, which is ribonucleic acid. There is certain difference between the two, but as I said, we don't need to discuss that here. So with the discovery of DNA, scientists, they eventually had found out the building blocks of our genes. And as you know, how the DNA, which carries the genetic information, is pretty much, it's not just pretty much, it's absolutely present everywhere in our body, in every cell of it. And it really, the information that is coded in the DNA, it determines a lot of things about how the body is going to grow, how vulnerable it is to certain diseases. All the biological aspects of human body, they are determined by it. But it's not just that one gene determines all these observable biological factors. No, it's a combination of multiple genes and the information that is there that determines these biological factors. At the same time, we must recognize that it's not just the DNA or the gene that is going to determine a lot of things. For example, height of a person or color of a person. It also depends on the environmental factors. So since there is constant interaction of human body through the environment, so these two things eventually they determine what the human being is going to become. But of course, DNA plays a very, very central role here. You know, your body pretty much functions on its own. For example, your heart is beating, all the organs are working on their own, new cells are being created, old cells are dying. All of this is happening on its own. Now, who tells this each cell to perform a particular function and when to grow and what to do? It's DNA, of course. And it's now scientifically established that each organism begins life as a single cell that contains its entire genetic code. And from the first cell, you get the cell division, and then you get more cells that carries the same information. And subsequently, more cells are created, and then you get the whole organism. It comprised of multiple cells, of course, and all of them contain the genetic information. And sometimes when the DNA code is being copied from one cell to another, there is a thing called mutation where there is an error in the copying mechanism of DNA. And that's where we get certain variations, and that's where we've seen a lot of evolution happening in different species. But as I said, the DNA plays a very crucial role. So for example, author talks about this experiment in 1970s when biologists at Cambridge University they decided to map every cell in a male earthworm, and there were 1,000 plus cells. So that team found out through the DNA that they could predict not only which role a cell would play, but exactly when it would do so. So for example, they found out that a particular cell would divide once every 12 hours or 60 hours later or another few weeks later. And when that cell would eventually disappear. So that information pretty much determines everything about the body. And now when in the 20th century, when this genetic science was growing, of course it was abused greatly, and most notably by Nazi Germany when they started killing Jews. And they made the same arguments that based on genes, certain races were superior and certain races were inferior. And that's why in order to produce really superior races for future, they justified the killings and sterilization of those races which they deemed inferior, which was really tragic, but at the same time an absolute pseudoscience, because science doesn't tell any of this. And all these things we learned as we progressed in science in the subsequent decades. For example, one particular question that was looming around this conversation of genes was about the new sequence of genetic codes. Can we create that in a lab? Because that would mean a huge shift in biological sciences. And eventually we found out that we could do that. And the process is still going on, but we have at least discovered that this has a huge potential. So DNA sequencing, for example, it can help diagnose a lot of diseases. That is by reading a person's genetic information. You could predict a lot of things. You could predict a lot of diseases that could occur in future. So it really has a huge potential. And even for really terrible diseases such as cancer, a genetic diagnosis was possible by reviewing a patient's complete genome. And it is for this reason, Human Genome Project, it started in 1990. And the goal of this project was pretty simple. That was to sequence the entire human genome. That is essentially drawing a map of the more than the 20,000 genes that make up human DNA. So whatever DNA we have, or the genes we have, it is just the combination of these 20,000 plus genes. And within 1 decade, this project published its first draft. And since then, we have had so much success in this area. We have found out answers to so many questions which previously wouldn't have been possible. For example, our common ancestry, where human beings come from, all the racist claims being made by the Nazi Germany and the likes of them, they were disproved. So for example, we found out that just around 100,000 years ago, or even less than that, all human beings, they lived on African continent. We were all there, and then certain groups started migrating, and some groups migrated through Europe to Asia, and then we got different races. But at the same time, it's worth noting that race is it's not about color at all. And what is interesting to note that is around 85 to 95% of genetic diversity in the human species is contained within the racial groups. So that means what we call the racial group, for example, Asian, white, black, in each racial group, you'll find more genetic diversity than you would find across races. So that is, two people will be completely different in their genetic makeup, even though they might appear from the same group. So that really, really shatters the racist claims made by many people. And the same thing could be said about the sex question and the gender identity. Because what we call male and female is essentially controlled by 23rd chromosome pair. And when these two chromosomes match perfectly, we call XX, that is for females, and one of the chromosomes is shortened and we call it the pair XY, that is what we use for males. So then again, anatomically you can get male or female, but that still leaves a lot of space for environmental inputs, and subsequently you still can have different gender identity, as a lot of people are having these days. And finally, we have this age-old question about nature versus nurture. And mostly when you find this discussion, you'll notice that people give very simplistic answers. That is, it's either nature or nurture. That is, Either it's in the genes, some people would say that it's in the genes, people are just born with some traits and talents, and others might claim that it's got nothing to do with the genetic factors, it's all environmental, and these things can be taught. And the answer, however, is people are born with genetic tendencies. They have certain vulnerabilities in terms of genes, but the environment can change a lot of things. And even the most important factor is that the environment itself can affect the genetic makeup of an individual. It can be through a traumatic experience, through certain molecules who get attached to the gene. All these things, the environment, what we are interacting with, this can impact our genes. But of course, beyond this, there is so much to learn from this book, and given its huge potential in the medical sciences in future, considering gene therapy, gene manipulation, and how we can expect pretty much everything here. We can expect cures of diseases which we think won't be possible, and we might even expect prolonging the life itself, and even the question of creation of new life. And that won't be such a bad idea, would it?